Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome to Atari A to Z Anthology. In this series we'll be looking at the Atari 2600 output of Activision, Imagic and Absolute Entertainment, as chronicled in the various Activision Anthology releases for various platforms. As much as I like those collections though, emulation has come a long way in terms of accuracy since they were released, and as such we'll be looking at the games using the most up-to-date emulators, and foregoing some of Activision Anthology's more gimmicky features such as the special projection modes it was possible to play the games in. The focus here is very much on the games themselves, because back in the heyday of the Atari 2600, an Activision, Imagic or Absolute Entertainment badge was almost always a guarantee of a quality release. Almost always, anyway. Today's game is Commando, a 1988 port of Capcom's highly influential 1985 run-and-gun arcade game. While its arcade version is very well known and well regarded, Activision's Atari 2600 port, developed by Gary Kitchen's Imagineering studio, is often forgotten. It's had very few re-releases over the years due to the complexity of the licensing situation, and most people tend to think that with such easy access to the arcade version these days, there's little value in returning to obviously inferior versions. But one of the interesting things about the home ports of arcade games is that they often had to be redesigned in various ways to fit within the constraints of the hardware they were working on. With the Atari 2600 being so radically different in architecture to the Capcom arcade hardware, not to mention several orders of magnitude less powerful, it's worthwhile to take a look at such a port and determine exactly how well it achieves its goal of bringing the arcade experience home, and indeed whether it still has value to today's retro gamers. It's also worth noting that as a 1988 release, Commando was very much part of the Atari 2600's second wind that came alongside the release of the Atari 7800 in the late 80s. While the 7800 was positioned as Atari's pro system, and rather unwisely attempted to take on the might of the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Atari 2600 was positioned as a low-cost, entry-level gaming machine that provided an affordable, if technologically simplistic, method of having some arcade-style fun on your home television. And it actually managed to squeeze out a good few years of extra lifespan by taking this approach. Not bad for a system that was already 10 years old by this point. While this period in gaming history was far from Activision's prime time so far as the Atari 2600 was concerned, the fact that the company was still continuing to support the system which had allowed them to come to prominence was noteworthy. It's a sign that at this point in time at least the company hadn't forgotten its roots, an attitude which arguably would change quite considerably in the subsequent decades as it became one of the biggest names in gaming. So with all that in mind then, let's go play the Atari 2600 version of Commando. Okay, here we are with Commando for Atari 2600. I actually didn't know this existed until quite recently, but I'm intrigued to try it. It's got a copyright in 1986 at the top, in the Data East copyright of all things. So yeah, like I say, the licensing situation on this was a bit complicated because it was a Capcom game originally. Then I think Data East brought it to America, and then Activision did the... so Activision published the 2600 version, but it was developed by Imagineering, who were part of Absolute Entertainment, which was formed by Gary Kitchen, who was a former member of Activision at this point. It's all terribly complicated, and this is why we haven't seen this version re-released officially. Aside from it being a version that some people don't see the value in, I guess, because it's a 2600 port of an arcade game that you can easily access via all sorts of different means today. But I'm intrigued to give it a go. So let's give it a go. Let's hit start. Or game reset more specifically. And off we go. So already we can tell it's a late era Atari 2600 game from the sort of technical proficiency of it. We've got some nice smooth scrolling. We've got lots of colours on screen. We've got some well-animated sprites. We've got quite a decent amount of things going on screen at once as well. We've got bullets. We've got different enemy sprites. You can only shoot one bullet at once, which is a bit of a shame, particularly considering you're supposed to be firing a machine gun. But yeah, the movement is smooth. There's no real flicker. There's an attempt at some music in the background. The level's not just looping. We've got some sort of pseudo 3D effects there. You see where we go under the bridge. We've got different types of enemies. Yeah, first impressions of this are very good indeed, actually. So while it's obviously not identical to the arcade version, this is for me what's interesting about sort of retro computer and console conversions of arcade games. Because they were often different by necessity, by virtue of the sort of technical limitations that the platforms imposed on the developers. The games had to end up a little bit different. And rather than that necessarily making them a bad version of a game, it just made it a different version of a game. Which these days I think is really interesting to explore. Because it's a new take on an established formula. And because of some of those technical limitations that form part of the gameplay, you have to play this a little bit differently from Arcade Commando. So because you can only fire one shot at once, you have to be a lot more accurate and careful with what you're doing. Oh dear. It becomes about precision and tactical positioning and all that sort of thing. £10,000, extra life, lovely. So how do we finish a stage? Do we just have to kill everything? Is it like the arcade machine where we have the swarm of enemies at the end, or do we have to keep going? No, we just have to go into the building to blow it up. And then, whoops. And then we proceed to the next stage, which in true classic Atari tradition is a different colour. And more difficult right from the outset. So more enemies on screen at once. Up to 4 enemies on screen at once. That's quite impressive. And then we've got things like the truck there as well. This is remarkably good. And as I say, it's lacking certain features that you would associate with Commando specifically, such as the ability to rapid fire your machine gun. This is more like having a pistol. But that's no bad thing, because again, it gives the game a distinct feel that makes it stand out. And it doesn't make the game worse, it makes it different. Which I think is always an important thing to consider when you're looking at ports like this. It's like, are those differences from the original arcade game, do they make it a worse game? Or do they just make it a different game? And in this case, yes, it may not be completely accurate to the arcade incarnation of Commando, but they do make it a solid attempt at a run and gun for the 2600. Oh, I see. So you have to destroy enough enemies to make the screen scroll up a bit, and then you walk into the building. Alright, onward. Extra life. Replace the one I just lost. There's the grenade. Those are a little bit feeble. In there, it's a little bit hard to judge where the explosion for them is happening. But I mean, they're there. You have the grenades. They're just a little bit awkward to trigger because in order to set them off, you have to hold down the fire button for a moment. Can you do it while moving? You can. And they always fly straight up the screen, so you can use that knowledge to your advantage. But they are a bit difficult to judge. So yeah, accurately hitting a moving target with them is tricky, but they can be used for things like hitting the enemies that are in the bunkers. Whoops! So I assume you probably can hit the... You probably can hit the trucks with them. But actually timing that is extremely difficult. And in this section here, because you can't throw the grenades down the screen, that truck just becomes an obstacle that you have to bear in mind while you're trying to complete that level. And different colour background again. Back to the desert sands, but orange instead of yellow this time. More trucks to deal with. Is this all the types of enemies we're going to have to deal with, or do you think... Ooh, what happened there? Do we think this is all the types of enemy we're going to have to deal with, or are there going to be some more? There's some interesting sort of perspective going on with the collision detection as well. So, if you're a certain distance above where a bullet is, you're sort of implied to be in front of it, so it won't hit you. That's quite an interesting approach, really. Okay, cool. Do we have any different game modes in this, I wonder? We have game 1 or game 2, presumably 1 player or 2 player. Okay, just the 2 game modes. Forgot to take a look at the manual for this before we started, didn't I? That's what we normally do. Never mind. I suspect, this being a late era Atari 2600 game, there probably wouldn't be that much of a manual. Because certainly Atari's own games by this point had relatively low effort manuals, so we're just sort of paper leaflets that told you how to play the game, yes, but they weren't as elaborate as the booklets we got earlier in the 2600's lifespan. Okay. On to the flurry of enemies. Tricky to hit you. Oh, but walking into an enemy seems to kill you. I assume that's like you being implied to be stabbed by them or something. I don't remember if walking into an enemy in the original killed you, but probably. I like Arcade Commando, but it is a very difficult game. Oh no! Doing very poorly this time. Disastrous. Alright, come on. It's the pressure. Now, I guess the question is, are there any set angles that they can fire at? Because in the original Commando, they could only fire in 8 directions. Oops. That was a good start, wasn't it? And taking advantage of that was an important part of being able to dodge enemy fire and stay safe. It's sort of letting off a few bullets or a grenade and then sort of sidestepping out of the way of the bullets that the enemies were firing at you. Yeah, I'm really impressed with this actually. This is a very respectable version of Commando. I mean, yes, some would say that it pales in comparison to, for example, the legendary Commodore 64 version, with its widely beloved Rob Hubbard music. Widely beloved with very good reason. Rob Hubbard's music for Commando is excellent. But considering what this is running on, it's hard not to come away from this impressed. Yeah, so like I say, my only sort of real hesitation with this is the grenade controls, which are a little bit fiddly. But it's one of those things where there wasn't really a lot of option for them in this. If you look at the home computer ports of Commando, most of them would either put grenades on holding down the fire button for a moment, or on a key like the spacebar. And indeed, they could have done something like that on the Atari 2600, because there were some games that made use of the console's switches. Things like the difficulty switches, the game select switch, the TV type switch in some cases, that was quite a popular one, to act as sort of extra buttons. But the difficulty there was... Oh, that's like a hole in the ground. That's not a... That's not like a wall, it's a hole that they're sitting down, like a trench. Yeah, so the difficulty with using the Atari 2600 switches as additional controls is that you couldn't necessarily guarantee that someone was sitting right next to the console. Because particularly in the late 80s, we were starting to get to a point where... No! We were starting to get to a point where TVs were getting larger. People were wanting to sit further back from them to enjoy their games. Cables were getting longer. People were using sort of extension cables and things on their joysticks. And so someone wouldn't necessarily have been sitting close enough to the 2600 to make using the switches particularly practical. There's also the fact that the Atari 2600 Junior, which was the later revision of the Atari 2600 hardware, that was around at the same time as this version of Commando, the switches on it were a little harder to press than on the original model 2600. So rather than those big metal switches, you had sort of squishy, flimsy, plasticky buttons that weren't very satisfying to press at all, and moreover would have been quite difficult to press in the heat of battle. And also the difficulty switches were actually right on the back of the console, so those would have been completely impractical to make use of in the middle of a game. So that's probably why they stuck with the single button control scheme. Of course, if you're playing Atari 2600 games on an emulator these days, you can always map those additional switches to buttons on your controller, so you can effectively have a multi-button control scheme for those games that require it. But that's not a luxury Atari 2600 players would have had back in the day. You would have had a one-button joystick, or that's it. Yes, you could plug in other controllers that use the same connector, such as the Mega Drive control pad is quite a popular choice. But only one of the buttons would work. Because the internals of the Atari 2600 were only set up to recognise one of those buttons. I suspect there are ways around that, just like people have found ways around it with home computers. You just have to look at the right location in memory to determine what is being pressed when, or what device is being used by what. But I'm not aware of one. I'm not aware of any multi-button Atari 2600 games. I'm aware of a couple that use multiple controllers. So, for example, Doug Neubauer's Radar Lock uses two controllers, one for controlling the plane, one for selecting weapons. And of course there's a few games that use like the keyboard controller or the video touchpad. But none I'm aware of that actually used a multi-button joypad or joystick. But that's fine, because most of the games that were around only really needed the one button. In the case of Commando... Oh. Fell down an owl. In the case of Commando here, the additional button would have been a nice to have, but not an essential by any means. Since you're always going to spend most of your time just pressing the one button. Sorry, I'm concentrating now, it's getting harder. Oh! You don't seem to be able to fire while you're under the bridge. Oh dear. Death. You don't seem to be able to fire while you're under the bridge. That's a bit of a shame. Anyway, I think I've probably reached my the limit of my skills at Atari 2600 Commando. Yeah, I'm impressed with that. That's good. That's good. That is a good Atari 2600 game. So if you've not tried it before, I recommend giving it a shot. It's worthwhile, definitely. Very, very pleasantly impressed with that. So we'll leave that there for today. Just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.